Hi, I hope you're doing well. This is Victor Candid. I'm really excited almost every time that I get the opportunity to talk to you. Today, I want to talk about some of the findings, or rather the findings from wave one of the Global Flourishing Study. I had to record this video earlier because we had to embargo every publication or media around the findings until the launch April 31st in DC. As most of you that know me personally also know about my work, I'm also part of the team that worked on the Global Flourishing Study. Itself, I led papers on hope, on place satisfaction, and also on belonging, and also I co-authored papers on prayer, meditation, and also overall on the flagship paper as well. In my work as a psychologist who is also interested in human flourishing, particularly drawn to psychological variables that I think might have relevance for my work. In fact, I tried to look at the Global Flourishing Study itself as a way to maximize or answer some of the questions that's been at the heart of my scientific inquiry or research itself. But today, what I want to do would be to share some of the findings from the first wave of the Global Flourishing Study. Not just findings from our work, but findings from also the work of my other colleagues who are also part of the work. That have done incredible work capturing global trends on flourishing. And I must say, it's been quite a milestone because I think we won analyses and data, and beyond just the study itself, also there are a lot of people that played a role. The analysis team, we had a stats team, we have the analysis team. All the first authors had to lead their papers with their teams, which could be the co-authors in their project, and also Tyler Vanderville and also Byron Johnson, who were incredible leaders in the whole process. I just want to say thank you to all of them for all they've done. But what I want to do today would be to summarize some of the findings. If you don't know already, the Global Flourishing Study, it's arguably the biggest or largest social science research or study in present history. It looks at well-being across 22 countries with over 200,000 participants, and the plan is to do a 5-wave data collection across those countries. So we've already collected wave one data and done the analysis and published. Most of the papers have already been published, and some are still on the way. Some have been accepted, some are still on the review as well. But most importantly, and interestingly as well, we also have the flagship paper, which kind of captures, kind of in a general sense, what the study is about and what we've done. Now we've also started with 2 data collection, which is in some countries it's almost ready, and it's been really exciting to see this come along. Now, the first thing I want to say as we start this conversation, and also as I summarize some of the findings from wave one study, with one data from the Global Flourishing Study, to start with asking question around what is flourishing. Now, I'm asking that because for some of you that might be watching this video and this is really your first time getting to know, hear about the word flourishing or human flourishing, or maybe this is your first time, listening, being on my platform, on my channel, and you want to understand what exactly flourishing is and how it connects to your work. Flourishing, ultimately, it's another word that some people use. Some scholars also use that to classifying it as well-being. But ultimately, flourishing is not a new term. It's something that have been in existence and has also been used by different scholars or philosophers, especially within the virtue ethic framework, with Aristotle as well, who started that conversation around the good life. And so flourishing in itself, at its core, it's not really about just feeling good, hedonic well-being. It's also about doing well in every aspect of one's life, whether it's your health, whether it's your relationship, whether it's in terms of your sense of purpose, your character, and even your financial security. And I think that's what's unique about the Global Flourishing Study, that it takes this multidimensional approach to engage the topic of flourishing, and in each of the domains and in each of the aspects of flourishing, ask the question, what are different constructs that represent, let's say, health, mental and physical health? What are the different constructs that represent character and virtue? Like, for example, within that domain or dimension, we have things like hope, we have things like optimism, we have things like quite volunteering as well. A number of variables that falls under that. The same thing also within financial well-being. The same thing within social relationship. We looked at general social relationship. We looked at, for example, loneliness as a construct that falls under that. We looked at things like people's relationship with the city or the place that they lived, all these different constructs that could help us understand each of these dimensions. Like mental and physical health, we looked at a number of things: anxiety, depression. We looked at smoking and as an aspect of those constructs. And just to ask the question around, what does this really look like when we take a global lens? But interestingly, again, when we talk about flourishing and the distinction with well-being, I'm not saying that's a clear-cut definition or distinction, but how we've tried to distinguish this is that well-being is how the aspect of our lives are good, how all aspects of our lives are good. But with flourishing, we kind of include the context, the environment, how aspect of our life is good in relation to our context. In other words, if you're doing well and your context or environment is not doing well, you're not flourishing. You might have a good sense of well-being, a better, an optimal functioning individual individual subjective well-being, but ultimately you're not flourishing. But if you're doing well and your immediate environment it's also doing well, then ultimately that's flourishing. And so I just said that as a pretext as we think about what flourishing might be in distinction when you contrast that with well-being. But in the Global Flourishing Study, we did measure the 6 domains of human flourishing based on the framework of Tyler Vandervelde, who was the co-leader or co-director of the Global Flourishing Study. We measure things like happiness and life satisfaction, and a number of constructs that falls under that. We measure the things like mental health and physical health, and a number of constructs that falls under that. We measure the meaning and purpose, character and virtue, close social relationships, and also financial and material stability. And we asked over 200,000 people in 22 countries how they are doing in this particular areas. And you know what we found might surprise you. And if you're interested in some of the countries that participated in the study, I'm happy to, share some of those, or you could also, on the description, you could look at the description to see all the studies. But some of the studies, of course, it's the United States. We had data from countries in Europe, like Sweden. We had data from Japan. We had data from Hong Kong, for example. We had data from the Philippines. We had data from South Africa. We had data from Kenya. We had data from Nigeria. We had quite a number of data. We had data from Argentina, for example, from Brazil, from Mexico. We had data from Australia. So we took a really global effort in the project itself, and you would arguably say it's representative of the world. And so one of the things that we found, some of the key findings was we saw who was flourishing and why they were flourishing in the different studies. And mind you, I'm talking about across over 100 papers. Of course, the flagship paper tried to summarize this, but we try to capture the idea just to get a sense of who is flourishing. But one of the things that stood out was that young people are struggling. In fact, in many countries like the US and the UK and the United Kingdom, and even in Brazil, young people seem not to flourish as much as older adults. So we found different kind of curves as we look at this. And interestingly, mental health challenges were also another issue. There was issues around job security as well, particularly for young people. And I think also a crisis for meaning, which seemed to hold a lot of these young people back. But interestingly, flourishing seemed to increase after the age of 50 in many countries, and which was really very interesting. So you could think of it as a U-shaped kind of form where flourishing starts out well, and then ultimately over time it decreases as people get to the mid-age, and then it picks up at 50. But also the second thing that we found was, and you could also talk about a number of reasons why this might be the case, but I would say the mental health crisis. We live in a very polarized society and in an environment where there is a search for meaning, and most young people are struggling due to that. But the second thing that we found that was interesting, especially when we think about who is flourishing, would be the fact that marriage seemed to work, and also employment, having a stable employment and being in a marital relationship is very important. In fact, being married and having a job that were both associated with higher levels of flourishing in different of the studies. In fact, I think that's because marriage offers people some kind of structure. Having an employment also offers some kind of support as well. Both marriage and work itself provide a sense of meaning and even a sense of security. So I'm not particularly surprised that we found this particular outcome. But the other thing that we found that was also interesting was the fact that religion was played a big role in most of the study. And I get it, most scientists are very hesitant when you talk about religion in scientific research, but the data was really clear. In fact, I think this is probably one of the strongest predictors of flourishing. Attending religious services, in fact, it's a public health issue in itself. I had one of my colleagues had written a paper, an article about this. But essentially, people who go, we found ultimately that people who go to religious services, whether you're talking about churches or mosque or synagogue or a temple, people who went to these services or religious services weekly or more, they often reported higher levels of happiness. They reported things like stronger relationship. They even reported things like having a deeper sense of purpose across almost all the countries that we looked at, which is very interesting. Of course, you could talk about why this might be the case, maybe the social support that they get from there, or maybe the fact that religion is sort of a social glue, and that connection that we have or experience within religious spaces might be playing a role. Or maybe could be, in my work, I've talked about spiritual ties to place, that the connection that we have, ultimately the connection to the sacred that people experience in sacred places, in certain places, for example, in worship spaces, might really be very important, especially how we think about flourishing. But also the other thing that we found, but we looked at the childhood correlates or predictors of flourishing across these different constructs. And one of the things that we found was that childhood experiences do in fact shape us. They do, in fact, shape us. In fact, we found that, for example, that a safe, healthy, and nurturing childhood sets the stage for adult flourishing. Of course, it's not necessarily a surprising finding because it's expected in some sense. But here's what's very hopeful about this particular finding. The fact that even those who had tough upbringing, people that had tough beginnings, things like experiencing childhood abuse, things like being raised in poverty, experiencing in some sense of loss, maybe divorced, growing up in a divorced household and all that, we still found that these people found purpose regardless later on as they became adult, especially when supported by strong communities and even, having that sense of spiritual meaning that might also come as a result of religious attendance. But the other thing also that we found was gender differences which really vary by country. In fact, for example, in Japan, women flourish more than men. In Brazil, it was kind of the reverse. And so flourishing is not just individual in that sense. It's kind of shaped by, culture. It's shaped by things like our gender role in our society. It's also shaped by our social context. Now, this is the first part of this presentation. The next thing I want to talk about would be, where are people flourishing? Given the fact that, if you remember, that I mentioned that the study was done across 22 countries. Particularly interesting as we look at the data and the results across all the studies was the fact that Indonesia led the way. In fact, they scored high in almost nearly every area, whether it's meaning, whether it's character, whether it's relationships, whether it's happiness. Ultimately, they were really at the top of the charts. There could be a number of reasons for that. Some would argue that perhaps it's more cultural than anything, because some cultures are more likely to score higher on anything, right? But some cultures are more reserved, like, for example, in some Asian cultures, for example, let's say you go to Japan, or maybe even in China, South Korea, they're most likely to be very modest in their scoring rates compared to some other countries. But what's interesting though is the fact that Indonesia led the way in almost all the constructs. The second thing that we also found was the fact that Mexico and the Philippines, they were also thriving despite having low national income. In fact, it's interesting to also see this because what I think they might have that sort of helped, in spite of the being categorized as one of the low-income countries, I think would be maybe the strong family ties, maybe the vibrant spiritual or religious culture in those areas, which might be playing a role in their tribe in Mexico and the Philippines. They kind of was also at the top of the charts. But interestingly, we found that in some Western countries like the US and the Sweden, people were doing well financially, but people struggled more when it came to things like meaning, things like relationship, and so it turns out, as you would imagine, based on this, that money doesn't really buy happiness, or neither does money buy purpose. Because even though that the populations and people in the US and in Sweden and most of the Western countries, even though they had a good financial well-being and stability, they still struggled with things like character and virtues, things like meaning, and purpose. But sadly, though, as we looked at all the studies, one of the things that we found that was not just shocking, but also of concern for all members of the team was the fact that Japan reported lower happiness and lower connection and lower levels in almost most of the um, um, indicators, even with them having a stronger economy. Now, there are a number of reasons that some of my colleagues has given for this. I also highlight this in my own paper would be maybe the long working hours that is part of the culture, the stress of the economy and the culture and the people, the stress on the lives of people, even social isolation, which may seem to have taken a toll in the life of people. But the third thing I want to talk about beyond just one who is flourishing, where people are flourishing, would also be what can we learn from this result? What can we learn from the wave one result of the Global Flourishing Study? Now, I think there are a few takeaways for whether it's a government agency or government watching this, or maybe community leaders that might be watching this, or even individuals who might think about how is this relevant for me. I think the first thing would be it's important that we support young people. They need help finding purpose. They need help finding connection. They need help with dealing with their mental health. They need help with mental well-being ultimately. And so programs, initiatives, and strategies that could be put in place to help young people realign themselves, to have a sense of purpose, to have better social connections or relationships, to also navigate challenges that comes with their mental well-being, I think would be such a blessing in this generation, in such a time as this, especially with the question around purpose. One of the things I always say is that every mental health problem usually starts with a question of purpose. And of course, I try to talk about it in many ways. I actually have a book coming out. It's called The Crossroads of Life. It's sort of taking if you will, a biblical lens to talking about telos or purpose and what that means. And I used the story of Saul, from the time that he was looking for his father's missing donkey to the time he was anointed the king of Israel. And I think that he stopped at different crossroads, and it has huge implications for how we understand purpose and destiny and the different crossroads that we stop. And any program that can help young people to navigate their sense of purpose, to understand, make meaning, to have a meaning-making framework, a better meaning-making framework, would be tremendous for this generation. The other thing I would encourage would be, I think it's important to invest in families and in childhood, because I think that's very important, as we found that childhood predictors was very prevalent and salient across most of the papers. And so having a safe, stable home is the basis of a flourishing future, and no doubt about that. Kids that were exposed to childhood abuse, that were exposed to negative childhood experiences, ultimately will struggle later in life. But the third thing I also would want to encourage, whether it's community leaders or even government agencies watching this video, would be it's important that we encourage strong relationships. Social bonds are foundational for well-being. And how we cultivate this across cultures will really very much differ because, again, relationships and what relationship mean in a Western culture, in a non-Western culture, in an individualistic culture, in a collectivist culture would always differ. And understanding, taking a context-sensitive approach to really nurture strong relationships, I think it's of great value. But as I end, the last recommendation, or what I would say, would be, I think perhaps it's time that we rethink what progress means for us as a culture, what progress means for your culture, your community, your country, because it's clear that economic growth helps based on our study, but it's only if it sort of nurtures things like meaning, things like character, things like human connections or social connections along the way. And so while it's important to focus on growth, take some kind of a GDP index or approach to thinking about what flourishing is for your community or for your country, I think it's important that we pay attention to virtues and character and virtues, things like meaning and purpose, all those value systems. What are the value systems that ultimately shape your people, your culture? And I think that's ultimately what really will determine whether or not they're doing well. Now, as a final reflection, I also think it's important that we have a global conversation. I think people everywhere want the same basic things. People want love, people want safety, people want purpose, people want good health, people want human connection. But how we get there can often differ, right? It can vary across different cultures. And I think that this study, the Global Flourishing Study, gives us sort of a global picture, a starting point for thinking about what this looks like across cultures. Of course, it's ethic in nature. It takes a universal approach. It's also an invitation for people and researchers across all cultures to take an emic approach. So now think about, what does flourishing mean in my context, in my country, in my culture? And now I think now it's time to go deeper and really to listen carefully and locally and build communities where everyone can flourish. And I end with this. I think that flourishing is not luxury. It is a human calling. And I'm hoping that we can build a world where everyone has an equal chance to thrive and flourish. This is Victor Counted. I hope this has been fun. It's been wonderful talking to you. And I'll speak to you on the next one. You take care.